think we'll start now. It's my pleasure to introduce Von Welch. Von is the director of the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. He's the associate director for the Indiana University Pervasive Technology Institute, director and PI for the Research Security Operations Center, also known as ResearchSOC. Additionally, he is the director and PI for the NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, also known as Trusted CI, of which our own cybersecurity division plays a big role, led by Jim Basney as deputy director. I can attest, at least for LSST, that we have benefited immensely from an engagement with Trusted CI 4 or 5 years ago, without which we would not have a mature cybersecurity program. And so when I hear a term enable science, I think of that as a really good example, at least from a cybersecurity perspective. And this is something I see Trusted CI do for a lot of NSF-funded projects and experiments. And so I'm really excited to hear this talk. It's something I think is incredibly important. And if I'm not mistaken, Vaughn in his past was once an NCSA employee and left as the director of cybersecurity. So welcome back, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you for this invitation to come back here and talk. As Alex mentioned, I was here, it's been almost a decade ago now, and want to echo Alex's statement about NCSA's involvement in this. And, just mention they're one of 6 key partners in the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And as Alex mentioned, Jim is the deputy. He was also one of the original crew along with Randy Butler, who got the center started back, really going back all the way to almost 2010. I'll mention a little bit of the history later. And then, the great team here, Terry, John, Kay, Jeanette, are all really, big contributors to the successes of this center. So what I want to talk about today is, first I'm going to start with sort of a more general introduction. A lot of people, you start talking about cybersecurity, in particular open science, and it seems oil and water. So why is this important, and why should the science community be listening to us talk about cybersecurity? How do we contribute to their mission? So I'm going to start with that. Then I'm going to shift and talk about some of the services that Trusted CI, the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, what it provides. And then just a little bit about the Research Security Operations Center that Alex mentioned, a second NSF-funded cybersecurity center that started up that I also have the honor of leading. So first I want to make a distinction about regulated versus open science. And I'm going to use the term open science a little bit loosely here. You can largely think of it as science that doesn't have an obvious cybersecurity program with it. So if you've heard terms like HIPAA before, or FISMA, or sometimes data use agreements, sometimes you have science that has a dictated cybersecurity regiment to it. When I refer to open science, I talk about science that really doesn't have that from any source. So you think astronomy, climate science, physics, geology, biology, a lot of these different things, and I'll have some examples of this. There's not an obvious go take off-the-shelf cybersecurity program for those areas of science. But as I'll demonstrate to you through this talk, they still have risks and other concerns that cybersecurity has a role of addressing. And then the other point I'll make is if you're on a university campus, and you look outside of the medical school, these open sciences are the majority of the research that generally is going on that campus. So this is not a on the fringe part of what we do in higher ed. This makes up a large part of what goes on in our campuses that we want to manage risks for. So the first myth I just like to take head on is the misconception. We tend to conflate the need for cybersecurity with the need for confidentiality. And the reasons for this, if you think about the cybersecurity breaches that you see in the headlines of the paper, they tend to be exposures of so many patient records or credit card numbers, right? It's about taking data that should have been kept private and getting stolen or exposed to the public, right? So we tend to have that strong connection between confidentiality and cybersecurity. And what I'm going to talk about is cybersecurity is broader than that, handling other risks that are much more important to open science, things like data integrity, things like instrument availability. So this is a key point to understand when we talk about cybersecurity here, as I'm speaking more broadly than this need for confidentiality. And so when I talk about cybersecurity for science, I like to organize it into three things that I really think speak to the scientific mission. And I want to talk to, have scientists, if we were going to talk about a mission for cybersecurity for science, we want to talk about enabling productive, trustworthy, and reproducible science. Three things that scientists would understand as opposed to a lot of the jargon that we tend to use in cybersecurity. So I'm going to relate to these 3 points. And I'm going to start with productive, and I think this is the one that's conceptually most easy to understand. This relates very much to a cybersecurity concept of availability. And the obvious one here is almost all of the scientific infrastructure these days runs on some sort of IT, whether it's HPC, high performance data, computing network, whatnot, or even the IT that's built into scientific instruments. This is an example here from Western Australia, telescope looking at a couple neutron stars colliding, and it was almost missed because they had to deal with a virus attack. That bad timing happened when this natural science event. So we have cases here where we've got unpredictable needs for our cyber infrastructure supporting science, and part of the role of cybersecurity is to make sure that our scientific instruments are available at the time when these needs come up. The other shift that's unfortunately happened the past 5 years, if you go back before that and you think about a lot of the cybercrime, it targeted data that was of immediate financial use. Credit card numbers, social security numbers for ID theft, etc. Then about 5 years ago, and this can easily be lost in all the jargon we tend to throw around about cybercrime, this new form of malware, malicious software appeared called ransomware. And the technical details aren't all that important. What's interesting about it is it encrypts your data and holds it, sells it back to you, holds it for ransom. And the shift that created meant that the data didn't have to be of financial value anymore to the cyber criminals. It just had to be of value to its owner. And so this expanded the set of possible targets for the cyber criminals to include hospitals, cities, scientific data, etc. And so this was an unfortunate shift in the landscape that expanded the target for the cybercrime and meant, we need to put a greater emphasis on making sure our data is available, backed up, and we've got protections against this sort of attack. The other challenge we come into is a lot of the IT infrastructure, the cyber infrastructure we use in science is not your standard enterprise IT infrastructure. A lot of those cybersecurity programs, advice, regiments that are out there are designed, a lot of them flow out of NIST and are designed for large federal bureaucracies. You can almost sort of picture like what's up here, just rows and rows of desktops sitting on something, as opposed to what we do in supporting science, where oftentimes we've got need for high performance, we've got need for national, even global collaborations that are very ad hoc and dynamic, right? They don't match what's in our university directories. It's not like the astronomy department all gets together and collaborates. It tends to be a diverse group of researchers from across the country who have graduate students come and go. So we have a number of challenges that really stress our traditional enterprise IT and cybersecurity roles on this. A great example of this that's well known throughout the networking community is the concept of a science DMZ, right? This is, in sort of non-technical jargon, this is a case of taking a network that's normally optimized for a business environment and instead optimizing it for high throughput science flows, right? So it's a great example, has a number of flow downs, right? One of the things that challenges is the traditional firewalls typically can't keep up with these high performance flows. So this is a case where we're having to take our normal enterprise IT infrastructure and adopt it for the science domain. I mentioned the rapid collaborative projects. I really like this image. This is back from 2015, just the top 10 collaborators on journal articles with US researchers from across the world. So you can really see the global nature of this. And point I make up here, another thing that challenges with these collaborations, you work with a researcher, the grant-funded world they tend to live in, you don't know a grant's going to get funded until just about the time it gets funded, and then you're off to the races. And you compare that with the culture that we often have within enterprise in our universities. We've got universities that are around for a century or centuries. They can take a slow, methodical approach. Their reputation's very important to them. So we have these real extremes sitting on the campus of order of timeline of decades to centuries versus you've got 3 years to get running and published, right? So two very different cultures that are often stress each other out. So let me shift to trustworthiness now. And as I mentioned earlier, science, particularly open science, doesn't have the strong need for confidentiality. There's a few exceptions I'll mention, but we've got integrity of data, which I think is really key and even growing increasingly important to some of the areas of science get politicized, like climate science. And I think we're going to be increasingly called on to not only know that our data has good integrity, but to be able to demonstrate that and prove it against attacks, perhaps baseless even to the contrary. And so we see the increasing need to have programs around data integrity, which is going a little bit different direction in response to some of the work we're seeing out of the federal government in response to data breaches. They're still very worried about confidentiality. So I think this is one of the places where we're splitting. We do have some confidentiality concerns that are a little bit different in open science. This is a slide from a project called Wildbook. It's work of Professor Tanya Wolfberger and her team from University of Illinois, Chicago. It's a fascinating project. They're using AI to identify images of individual animals and track them. So they can track an individual animal migrating, photos from park rangers, tourists, whatever, and track it. The challenge they face is, of course, some of these animals are endangered species. They've got geolocation and images. So they want to be able to do access control and not let this fall into the hands of poachers and others. So they want to have tight control over the raw data that has this geolocation in it until they get things processed, a time delay in its release, all these other issues that are driven solely by their ethical concern for the safety of these animals as opposed to any regulation or cybersecurity regime. So another group, just like Alex mentioned with LST, that we have spent time working with to address these particular risks to them. Even in open science, we see little examples of areas of confidentiality. Usually it's around quality assurance, wanting to have the data be vetted and assured before it comes out. So there are some needs for confidentiality, even in science that ends up completely on the open. So this is a common area of risk that we end up tackling as some sort of embargo period on data and results. Finally, I think a point that is growing in concern for me, a little bit more subtle, is that we need to, in some sense as a community, just appear to have our act together. If we start to be seen as a community that is hacked often, making the news too much, particularly if we're used maybe not even as a target ourselves, but to get to other more sensitive research, military or health research or others, we're going to face increasing pressure from federal agencies to adopt cybersecurity programs that I argue may be less appropriate for us than ones we would come up with ourselves. So there's this sort of need for good hygiene to make sure that we've got are in control of our own work, and rather than having something put down upon us. Reproducibility is the third point I want to talk to, and first I just want to acknowledge in general reproducibility in computational science is very much a research area. There's a group of researchers looking at it. There's a number of folks in looking at repeatability, particularly in high performance systems and fault tolerance. And I think one of my argument here is basically not that cybersecurity should solve the reproducibility problem. I think it's much too large for that. But I think we in the cybersecurity community have a responsibility to have a voice in this discussion. And the basic simple premise on this is the following. If you've got a computer that's been hacked or is being misused, even if the perpetrators don't seem to have any interest in anything else going on that computer, they don't care about the science, they're just using it to mine Bitcoin, you're in some sense starting to roll the dice with what's going on in that computer. Are they intentionally or unintentionally impacting the science that goes on there? And as today, we don't have any good way of sort of reasoning about these things. We have a scientific workflow that completes, and then we find out 3 months later some number of the systems on it were hacked. We don't have any good way of sort of structuring, okay, how do we think about making sure that those scientific results have real data integrity around them and are trustworthy. So this is sort of one of many open areas, I think, in this space, right? So what are the impacts of that? Do those results get an asterisk by them? Do we have some concept of error bars around results? A couple other ones I've talked with colleagues, I've been talking to some of the reproducibility community. We have a real tension for the repeatability community in particular. They love containers, virtual machines, Docker images, because you can take a software stack, somewhat freeze it, then come back 6 months, 6 years later and rerun a scientific code just the way it was. Well, as any of you know who probably use a computer, what does it do about every 2 weeks? It wants to pop up and update the software on that computer and fix a security vulnerability. So we have this real clash right now between these two cultures. One who sort of likes a nice frozen software stack, and then us on the cybersecurity side who wants to keep updating that software stack to fix problems. And ideally, we on the cybersecurity side, we fix our cybersecurity problems without impacting the performance or the functionality of that system in any other way. But in reality, it's not always that clean. Some of you maybe have tracked some of the more recent processor problems, Spectre, Meltdown, and some of the newer ones know, sometimes we unfortunately have major performance impacts as we deal with cybersecurity problems, and how do those start trickling over? What's the bar for them starting to impact repeatability and reproducibility? Another challenge we have is oftentimes we've got some of the confidential data or software. I go back to the example Tanya in the Wild book, right? So what does it mean to have reproducible science when not all the data can be made available? So what are the right protocols for someone to be able to reproduce and get access? And then ultimately, one of the things that's come out of the conversation, what are the right trade-offs in all this? I would like to say that the cybersecurity is always doesn't have an impact on usability and the productivity of science. In real life, that's not always possible, or let me put it this way, not always possible at the costs we're willing to pay. So there's trade-offs on that. So we need to find what's the right knee in that trade-off as we go through this. So let me shift now. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of an understanding now why the NSF Cybersecurity Center of Excellence exists, and why there are actually some unique challenges in the science space for it to adopt. So this is not just an organization that's looking to push sort of off-the-shelf cybersecurity programs, but is in a dual role, as implied by its mission statement, of both serving the community and tackling these cybersecurity challenges and leading the community in tackling these cybersecurity challenges. We're trying to sort out some of these tough issues, while on the other hand, as we've done with some of these projects I've mentioned, help them get off the ground. And just to give a little bit of context, most people hear about an NSF center and they ask what software products we're producing for them. And if we go back to, this is a set of workshop reports that Randy, Jim, and I were involved with back in, I think these are from 2010 and 2011. For those of you who might remember at that time, NSF was just ramping up on what are now the software institutes, things like Nancy Wilkins Deer Science Gateway Community Institute, Daniel Crawford's Molecular Science Institute, and the new high energy physics one. And so the question NSF we suggested was, well, let's hold a couple workshops and find out what software the community wants for security. And so we held the first workshop and sort of asked that question, and we're basically told by the community, you've got the wrong question. We've got a bunch of software out there on cybersecurity right now. It's kind of coming out of our ears. What we really need is guidance and help in figuring all this out in our software, in the infrastructure we're developing, and we really want guidance that's unbiased and trustworthy. One of the artifacts of our community is you tend to get a grant for the piece of software, and then you become salesperson in chief for that software. So they have lots of people telling them that they've got silver bullets to solve the problem, but what they really needed was this unbiased advice. So we heard that in the first workshop, ran a second workshop, heard that message repeated. And so what you'll see with the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence is it's not a technology producing organization. It provides the leadership and the support. If we were in the private sector, you'd think of us as a professional consulting group. And so have that sort of model in mind as I talk through this. If you're looking for the software product that we produce, you're not going to see that. Instead, you're going to see a set of services that we provide in terms of engaging with and helping the community. So we've now been up and running under a couple different grants since 2012. The result after those two workshops that I just mentioned. And I'm very proud of the impact we've had on the community at this point. Nearly over 260 projects that we've impacted through our training, through direct one-on-one engagements, through our summits and whatnot. So, to a large extent, what the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence has been is an exercise in community engagement. And I think we've done very well on this front. Particularly given the fact that cybersecurity wasn't something that people were necessarily super excited to have us come in and talk to them about. I think because of some of the cultural mismatches I mentioned. So very nice engagement report that was Jim, John, and Jeanette put together last year. Some updated numbers on the left here, but I think we've done very well on this front. Particularly, gotten through 2 grants with a third, optimistically pending at this point. So I think the results are bearing out well. One of the ways we stay most tightly connected to the community is through what we call one-on-one engagements with a capital E. So spending months working closely with a project on a cybersecurity challenge. Alex mentioned LSST is a great example of this, and that is a very common one that we will do. As a project starts up, they'll come to us. We're very nervous and anxiety, have a lot of nervousness and anxiety about cybersecurity, but honestly, we don't know where to start. Typically, they find the amount of material out there and the guidance both overwhelming and contradictory and challenging. And so we will work with them to walk them through that process. Other engagements, we will really, if anyone comes to us with an engagement need that's related to cybersecurity, privacy, identity management, we'll try to tackle it. We've done everything. We worked with the city of Chicago and the Array of Things project on privacy there as they rolled out instruments as a scientific project in the city. We've done a number of identity management works. We've evaluated pieces of software, both in terms of implementation, looking at the code, and architecturally looking at new features. We oftentimes come in and review existing cybersecurity programs. As I like to tell folks, come to us with a question and we will find a way to work with you to help you on that. So, and just a little map showing a pretty good distribution of this, and we've even worked with folks outside the continental US, including the US Antarctic program, so getting all the way down to the South Pole. The annual summit, and I'd just like to go into depth, we restarted this in 2013, and yes, it's folks getting together. We've been breaking down a lot of barriers. There's a lot of resistance when we started to people sharing lessons learned. They like to sweep cybersecurity incidents under the carpet. Everything's great here. We don't need to talk about this. And it takes time and trust to build up these connections between the community members before they can start sharing these sorts of experiences. So these have really been critical to our success in doing community engagement, is this face-to-face interactions not only between us and the community, but amongst the community members. So, and just the plug for this, it's going to be the first time this year away from Washington, D.C. It's going to be out in San Diego in October this year. So we're going to take it on the road and give our colleagues in the Pacific time zone a little bit of break from 8 a.m. Eastern time meetings this year. Then obviously the challenge with one-on-one engagements is they're great, but they don't scale. And so in order to address some of the scaling issues, as we start seeing best practices emerge from our own work, we publish them, get them out there, often in collaboration with a small working group from the community. So if you visit our website, you will see a number of different pieces of practice on this. One of our most popular, we have a guide for developing cybersecurity programs, having done that a number of times. And so we've had projects that will often just pick that up and are able to work through our set of templates and develop a cybersecurity program with no help or minimal Q&A with us. So very proud of sort of being able to take our knowledge and distill it down into things that are understandable and helpful for the community. Do just want to mention we've got a 5-year vision out there, and we always welcome feedback on this. So this is about a year old now, so I think it extends to 2023, some idea of where we're going and what we're hoping to do going forward, to build some of this up. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll leave this for reading in your own time if you're interested. And also speaking of long terms, one of the big challenges that we have, and this is a challenge for cybersecurity generally, is measuring our impact. It's great that we do all these things. I've put a lot of metrics up here so far, the number of communities we engage with. For those of you who sort of know metrics well, you might say, well, it's great, so you're doing the process right. Is this having a real impact? And this is a tough question for us to answer. And the way we're starting to do that is now every other year putting out a community survey to get back feedback from the community on the state, the maturity of their cybersecurity programs. So can we start demonstrating we're doing all this stuff, we're providing the training, and yes, we're having the persistent behavioral changes that we want to see from the community. And so this is our way of doing that to demonstrate our long-term value on this front. We're about to release this in 2019, so please do look for that. And if you run an NSF project, we welcome your response to this, because the more data is better. Brand new this year, really excited about this. We've started a program of cybersecurity fellows. We've got an initial cohort of 6, and really looking to build a long-term set of relationships. This is modeled after different fellows out there. The Campus Champions have this program, and the UK Software Sustainability Institute has been doing this for a number of years, and actually Dana Brunson, now at Internet 2, has joined our team specifically to help us lead this. She's got a lot of experience in doing this sort of community building. So we've got a group of 6, both from some science domains and also from cybersecurity folks from different universities, so to start building a network of folks out there who understand these cybersecurity challenges for science, and hopefully also help distill them both into the domain sciences and the cybersecurity research community. Another activity that we're involved with is stepping back to National Science Foundation. For those of you who know their portfolio well, NSF funds a large amount of cybersecurity research. One of their biggest portfolios is what's known as the SATC program, Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace. However, there's a big challenge about getting all that cybersecurity research into practice. A number of reasons for that. There's a famous paper out there by Doug Mon, the valley of death between research and practice. And so we work with the community to try to identify connections between practitioners and researchers, and now also trying to bring entrepreneurs into that to try to help build that bridge to bring some of this research into practice. We've got a workshop coming up later in June up in Chicago. Florence Hudson, some of you may know, Jim Basney are going to be at that, and we've got a pretty exciting group of both industry and research folks to come together to look at this particular topic. The other thing we've started this year, I mentioned, we've got all these sciences that don't have a defined cybersecurity full program. And we've had some initial efforts at this with our guide, but we think the time is really getting to be right to formalize this a little bit more. Both on the technical side, we believe we understand now well enough what we're doing, and we have a broad enough experience with the community and strong enough relationships that this has some momentum to it. Also on the political landscape, we believe that we need a good alternative right now for campus CISOs and CIOs to be able to point at, as we're seeing more pressure to adopt other cybersecurity programs. And for those of you in the field, I'm talking about things like 800.171, CUI, HIPAA, that there needs to be something that there's an option there for a campus to say, we're going to do our open science under the trusted CI framework. So we want to look to formalize something like this that's appropriate for open science, that handles these particular challenges it has, and has enough structure and adoption that it's something that we can deploy on campuses and have next to these other programs coming down from the federal level. And part of that is we've done some work with risk profiles. One of the things I mentioned is a lot of the cyber infrastructure is very different than enterprise. That often causes challenges between cybersecurity folks and the scientists. The cybersecurity folks are very used to doing risk assessments of work. The scientists know the instruments well, but there's a gap there. And so we've worked to create, basically a Rosetta Stone to help those two folks translate the risk from scientific infrastructure into these risk assessments the cybersecurity professionals are used to. And so this is a key thing that we see feeding into that framework. I have gone through a little bit of a laundry list of our services here today. It is not exhausted. We'll leave it to our website and some of the URLs you see up here for other things that we provide. And certainly welcome, contacts. We've got emails up there, or you're welcome to contact myself or Jim to talk about, any other cybersecurity challenges your NSF or even other science projects may have. So last thing I just want to talk about is the new peer center to Trusted CI, which is the ResearchSOC, or the Research Security Operations Center. So this was a second center funded by NSF about a year ago. It just really started at the start of 2019. So just to contrast the two centers, you've heard me talk about Trusted CI on your right up here. It's sort of the professional services, the leadership, the consulting type of a center. The Research Security Operations Center is much more about bits and bytes flowing over the wire. It builds on some existing cybersecurity, infrastructure services that I'll mention in a second to actually provide operational cybersecurity services to the community. And so it is a collaboration between IU, Jim Marsteller at PSC, who's involved with both projects as I, and also our colleagues at Duke and University of California, San Diego. And it builds on some existing infrastructure, the OmniSOC, which is a collaboration between Big Ten universities to do a security operations center at IU, Stinger, which is a virtual honeypot services that Tracy Pruthi and Richard Bevere and their teams at Duke have been working on. San Diego, Mike Korn, who's the CISO there, is very involved to help outreach to the information security community. We know we need to impact that community for this to really have strong impact. And then Jim Marsteller and his team, working with the Three Rocks regional network there, are bringing a vulnerability identification service. And so we're ramping these up in 2019. We're engaging with some projects starting at the end of this year, and then looking to go into a sustainability fee for service mode in 2021. And I'll refer you to the URL there for more details, or I'm also happy to take questions. So with that, I would really like to thank you all for your attention. I thank NSF most very deeply for their support of these and the contributions of the entire Trusted CI and ResearchSOC teams for making all of this possible. And with that, I think we've got a little bit of time for Q&A if folks have any questions that I can answer. Looks like Davey, we got a microphone coming.
Regarding the ResearchSOC, what's the duration of that grant? Does the grant end then in 2021, and that's when the client service offering that'll theoretically sustain that off into the future continue?
Yeah, that's correct. It's a 3-year grant spanning basically 2019 through 2021, with the idea being it's startup funding, and by the end of 2021, we're to be sustainable under a fee-for-service model.
Okay, thank you.
John.
So as part of your assessments, and you may do this already, I never see the detail. I only see the sort of the final report sorts of things. But it would seem to me that you might also along the way develop a cybersecurity maturity model similar to what Gartner does for IT maturity models or things like that. Because not every project needs the same level of protection, right? And it may be an easier language to use for this requires this level of cybersecurity maturity or not. And then you have a checklist to go against to make sure you've met that, just to make it a little easier for people to understand where they are, because a lot of them probably coming in for these assessments really don't have any clue. It also might give you a little bit of means of saying, when we first started the engagement with them, we did the assessment, they were at this maturity level. After our engagement with them, they're at this maturity level, which is another way to show your impact with respect to those projects, but it gives a common language to understand what the level is that various projects are at.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the suggestion being one for a cybersecurity maturity level. The observation I make is, I believe, I can't remember if it's CARC or CASC, is currently working on a research computing maturity model, which I'm keeping an eye on. And part of the reason for that is, to be honest with you, one of the things we find when we engage a project on cybersecurity is we often end up sorting out a lot of what other people might call sort of system administration or basic governance. So a lot of unrelated but things that cybersecurity rely on. And so, simple example, right? It's hard to do cybersecurity well if you're not administering your systems well, right? You don't even have an inventory of what you've got and no centralized way of managing them. So I think what we're going to find is a cybersecurity maturity model, like we found with so many other things with cybersecurity, is going to be largely sort of dependent upon a general research computing, IT, cyber infrastructure maturity model, and may even map almost directly. So what we may find is with that research computing maturity model, we may just sort of adopt it and then just say, look, if you're at this level of research computing maturity, here's what that means for cybersecurity. So that's my rough thought on that. So rather than going off and kind of creating a parallel one, I think building upon something more general may make sense in this case because of that.
Yeah, I agree. You should align with other things going on in the community there, but having a language about a maturity level with respect to cybersecurity, I think, is an important thing. And I think it's useful for awardees when they're reporting back to NSF. They can say, you know, here's where we're at.
Yeah.
And I think that's helpful for them to be able to state that.
I agree, and we actually, I do have a paper out there from, I think, 4 or 5 years ago where we looked at a level of maturity for software projects relative to cybersecurity. One of the things we've worked on is we see a lot of software projects, you know, the SI2 program that vary wildly in what they consider to be a mature piece of software. And so adding some language to that was an initial stab. We're in complete agreement, and I'm just sort of, you know, fine-tuning the implementation.
Excellent.
Well, very good. I'll just say it's been, thank you again for having me back here. It's been a great opportunity. Nice to see some, you know, number of familiar faces, and really appreciate this, and thank you very much.